more signal you give to the algorithm, the better the algorithm performs, right? In the pre-ATT world, if you give more purchases, the better the algorithm performs. Obviously, the algorithm would take purchases from you and everybody else in the world, and it would just do better. Now, obviously, it's just taking your trials and doing much, much better.
Hey, you're listening to the Sub Club podcast, a show dedicated to the best practices for building and growing subscription app businesses. We'll share insider secrets from the top subscription apps on the app stores. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Sub Club podcast. I'm your host, David Bernard, and with me as always, Jacob Biting. Hello, Jacob.
Hi, David. Here with you as always.
Our guest today is Shamanth Rao, founder and CEO at RocketshipHQ, host of the podcast Mobile User Acquisition Show, and lead instructor at the workshop series Mobile Growth Lab. Shamanth's company, RocketshipHQ, is a boutique growth marketing agency with 8 figures in managed spend. Prior to founding RocketshipHQ, Shamanth led growth marketing, leading to 3 exits. Hey, Shamanth, welcome to the podcast.
Honored to be here. Thank you for having me, David and Jacob.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with a little bit of a history lesson. You've been in mobile advertising and working on mobile apps for since very early. And so could you take just a couple of minutes and step us through the history of kind of what led us to today with app tracking transparency and all the different ups and downs and changes that have happened over the past decade?
Yeah, there's been a lot of ups and downs, as you said, but I think I see 2 overarching trends. But for folks who want to go into the weeds, I would actually recommend 2 podcast episodes. One was mine with you, David. It is called A Brief History of App Store Monetization. You provide a very great perspective into how the App Store itself has changed over the years. The other one was an interview I did with David Phillipson. It was titled A Brief History of Device Identifiers. As you know, we're all about brief histories over here. But I think pertinent to what we're talking about, ATT and how that essentially disrupted growth marketing today. There have been 2 forces that have led us to this point, which over the last decade or so, right? And I think it's important to know and understand both of these just to know how we got here and why it's important, right? Because ATT just did not happen overnight. ATT, there was science for a decade. And, I think obviously a lot of this is evident in retrospect, but I think it's helpful to know and understand what those breadcrumbs were. Trend number 1 was that there has been increasing accumulation of purchaser data by platforms over the last decade. I remember, David, as you pointed out, I am a really old person who was around when mobile advertising just took off with all this gray hair. But, when I started out, we were doing CPC buys, CPM buys. I started doing mobile advertising before Facebook even had mobile app ads, right? And there was no conversion tracking. In fact, there was like no conversion tracking. If you would buy installs and you're like, oh, we bought so many installs, we got so many purchases, and we are profitable. And we spent like millions on games at the time, and some of the roles at it, right? So certainly the level of sophistication that emerged in mobile advertising, I don't think we could have foreseen 2012, 2013, 2014. But like I said, from the CPC buys, gradually there were CPI buys as ad networks that now are billion-dollar companies, IronSource and AppLovin. They were tiny ad networks at the time. A lot of others basically fell by the wayside. They were like, we have enough confidence to be able to bill per install rather than just per click or per impression, just because we have that kind of data, that kind of confidence. The next step really was Facebook's AEO, or purchase optimization. This was 2016, right? Which seems so recent. And it's just staggering to think that we could not optimize for purchases like as recently as six years ago. Crazy. And that was just the biggest game changer. And I still remember having a lot of skepticism that this would even work. And I'm like, how are they going to find out who's going to purchase? We've never done it. Nobody's done it. But clearly somebody could do it with Facebook, right? So they had the purchaser data. And I think only subsequent to that point of time, I think it became evident to me myself that as to why Facebook was so successful, because basically of the IDFA, right? IDFA and Google ID. They had that IDFA footprint from their family of apps, and certainly on Facebook Audience Network. So they were able to predict with eerie accuracy who the purchasers were. Obviously, they took it a step further with ROAS optimization, right? So, and obviously, the more data Facebook's SDK got, the better it got at predicting who the purchasers were. Obviously, the more data the pixels on the web got, the better the accuracy of the SDK became, and the other way around, right? Because they had, if you made a purchase on a beauty website, you would make a purchase on an e-commerce app. So they put all of that data together, right? So obviously, Google had a very, very similar trajectory. I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but over the last decade, increasing amount of data got accumulated by Facebook, by Google, folks like AppLovin and Iron Source, all the ad networks, everybody got increasing amount of data about users' purchasing habits. Obviously, they just weren't doing this in isolation. Apple wisened up to this. Google had a bit of a conflict because they were also making money off of this. They are also making money off of this just now, so they have been less active in pushing back. But Apple said, Apple's, again, not to go too much into the weeds, but it's part corporate strategy for Apple to say, we are privacy minded, but it's also very, very much about profits for them. They are promoting their own ad network now, albeit I don't know. I don't have a lot of confidence as to how they will do. Anyway, right? So Apple said, look, we had this UDID, which is non-resettable. Let's phase it out. Let's have an IDFA, which is resettable, which turned out wasn't too much of an improvement. Then they said, let's make this IDFA 0, but IDFA 0, which means if a user goes on and turns off the LAT, the IDFA becomes 0, and advertisers cannot target people. Shockingly enough, prior to IDFA 0, which was I think 2016, they still had LAT, but if a user turned off LAT, it just meant advertisers, please don't track this user. It was almost like a request. Right. It was a non-enforceable request. Basically, guys, please don't track me. But obviously, nobody cared. Right? Anyway, so even LAT 0 was a very, very telltale sign that this is where the ATT is where Apple is headed. And if you had to look on the web, Safari had intelligent tracking prevention. They have obviously been much more active on the web in terms of privacy crackdowns. Mozilla had what's called ETP. I think it's called efficient tracking prevention. I forget what it's called. But then Chrome, of course, said, hey, we're going to deprecate third-party cookies. They've extended the deadline. But there's been a lot going on in the direction of privacy, right? And that has happened very, very much in parallel with increasing accumulation of data by platforms. And to some extent, it hasn't been surprising for anyone who's followed the breadcrumbs. LAT's gone to 0, and 2018, Apple said kids apps will not allow tracking. That was almost like a trial balloon for ATT. And of course, 2020 ATT hit. It was not unsurprising, I would say, right? That it came to be just because of everything over the last decade that I just described.
Yeah, that's a really great way to summarize it, is those two parallel courses with, it's like in the shadows, there was like more and more data accumulation feeding all of this. But simultaneously, there was more and more awareness of privacy concerns and what that data was being used for. And that, it does seem like the press, had a big influence in this. I mean, when it was in New York Times and Wall Street Journal, both had big posts in like 2017, 2018, where they showed, how you could track individual users and when they're going to, a certain medical clinic, or there was another set of stories around U.S. service members who were being tracked by fitness apps and revealing basic, what we call previously unknown military installations and things like that. So, there was a lot going on that has led us to this point. So now Apple has dropped the bomb app tracking transparency. You're not allowed to track unless you first prompt. And we could talk an hour on all the different motivations and and even the way they deliver it. The way they request the prompt is and the wording of the prompt has even drawn controversy. But let's not get into that.
I still, every time it comes up, I still don't know what to click.
But let's talk about the real world impacts, because I think there's been a lot of ink spilled and a lot of discussions around those other things. But what I want to hear from you, as someone who manages a ton of spend and works in the industry and has to deal with this day in, day out. Let's talk through the real world impacts of how this is impacting the apps that you work with and what you've seen kind of in the broader industry. I thought it was interesting, before we jumped on the and started recording, you actually said you were expecting a crazier summer. So let's just start with that. So you're not quite seeing the disruption you initially expected. Is that, am I overreading that?
I don't want to be grandstanding here, but I certainly was prepared for far, far worse.
Right.
And I don't want to jinx this, but certainly there are a couple of advertisers we're working with that are doing all right, that are actually growing. But I'll talk about the mechanics that may have contributed to that further on. Right. But I certainly was prepared for far, far, far worse, I would say.
Yeah. So what are you seeing? I mean, And one of the things you've mentioned before is that you are seeing some shift to Android. Tell me about that shift to Android spend. And is that in certain categories, or is that across the board?
I think it's across the board. I think it's much more so in gaming. And if you look at a bunch of MMP reports and estimates, they peg the shift to about iOS spend drop to about 30 to 40%. I think that sounds like a realistic range. Obviously, there's some verticals that are hit much, much harder, right? But definitely, I think there's a lot of spend shifting to Android. I would attribute some of that to the fact that tracking is broken, but performance isn't. I hate to say this, right? And it's like a number of folks we work with, and we also advise, and I've just talked to, they're like, oh my God, my CPA reported by Facebook is terrible because Facebook's not tracking anything. And then when we look at their blended numbers, which is basically the money they make and the trials they get and the subscriptions they get or the purchases they get, it's all right. Which is exactly what I mean by it not being as bad as I expected.
Right.
If you look at the iTunes dashboards, you're like, you're doing all right. You didn't just go crashing down, which is what I was afraid would happen, right? And that has not happened. So, but what is real and true is, like I said, tracking is broken, even if performance is not, right? And tracking is just broken just because Apple has a concept of privacy threshold, which basically means if a campaign does not have a minimum number of installs or purchases, Apple's going to show zero purchases. They report all installs, but they report very few purchases. What that means is if you are, let's just say, a casual game or a social casino app that has a cost per purchaser of $150 to $200, which is not uncommon for these apps, then each campaign, if you're running $500 a day per campaign, you get 2 purchases, so 3 purchases per campaign, which just gets obfuscated by the privacy threshold, which means if you run a $500 a day campaign, you're probably getting purchases, you're just not seeing them, which is better than a world where I'm not getting purchases. Right? So,
yeah. Are we back to the old days of half your advertising budget is working?
yeah,
You just don't know which half.
yeah. Very much true.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. So the pullback on the spend, like, is that? Do you know where that's coming from along the chain? Is that companies not being sure anymore and pulling back? Is it agencies? Is it all along? Because at some point somebody has to. Because it makes sense that, like, well, one, we don't know how effective all this stuff was to begin with, right?
Yeah,
and so just losing the tracking doesn't necessarily mean it's less effective. It just means we don't know.
Yeah.
And so it seems a little foolhardy to just dial back, right?
Yeah.
You know, especially if your business relies on it. But it seems like that's what most, or at least some percentage of companies have done. They've pulled back just because they're not sure.
Yeah, I think I will also say a lot of companies that have pulled back have had relatively strong Android products. The couple of companies that I know that are doing very well on iOS now actually don't have very strong Android products, and they were like, we don't have a choice, right? We don't have a choice. We'll do what it takes. I obviously, I don't necessarily mean to imply that strong iOS products will result in strong performance, but having a fallback means, all right, we're going to take iOS a little bit easy, move some spend to Android while we figure out what is going on. Jacob, to your question, I think a lot of that's coming from companies, especially larger established companies that have had BI teams and reporting systems and dashboards that report on D7 ROAS at the creative level are like, we just don't have that in our reports anymore.
And they're spending too much to be confident in just YOLO spending, right?
Yeah.
Are you seeing any specific trends on CPMs and cost per trial or anything like that, as far as with the drop in spend on iOS and the increase on Android? Has some of the performance on iOS not degrading been more to do with market dynamics changing versus it actually just working as efficiently?
Yeah, I try not to look at CPMs just because CPMs are very contingent on the kind of optimization you have. Like, in April and May, if you had value optimization, you'd be paying CPMs that went through the roof. And your CPMs on Audience Network would be higher than Instagram and Facebook. And the CPMs are a little bit of a fuzzy metric. What I like to look at is really the CPA, which is the cost per trial, which also has become fuzzy because of the privacy threshold. So now it's blended cost per trial, which is actually being steady now. Like, to your question, to your underlying question about, do I attribute that to the underlying market dynamics? Definitely, I think that the fact that there's lesser competition, I do think, has contributed to the blended CPA being steady for folks that have continued to do iOS. Definitely, I do think that the lesser competition has played into that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit, because this is kind of our wheelhouse at Revenue Cat, obviously. Nice shirt, by the way, Jacob.
This is the original first ever Revenue Cat t-shirt.
Nice. How are subscription apps being impacted in what you've seen, and then how is that different from games and other categories that you're working with?
Yeah, I would say subscription apps are hit much less hard than a lot of games. Again, I just qualify. I don't want to sound like I'm grandstanding, because this is not like a party, a fiesta yet, but I think they're doing better than folks who are really clueless. I don't want to say clueless, but folks who just are struggling. I talked about, let's just say a hypothetical casual game or a social casino app that has a cost per paying user of $150. They get killed by the privacy threshold. A subscription app is less impacted by that, just because, again, your cost per trial, which is the primary metric nearly every subscription app optimizes for, is generally under $50, which means for the same $500 budget, you're getting 10 purchases, so you're less susceptible to that privacy threshold, right? And the other factor that makes the whole ATT thing a lot easier for subscription apps is that nearly every subscription app I know has 90% plus of their free trials happen within the first 24 hours of install. What that means in the ATT paradigm is nearly all of that signal gets captured by the ATT algorithm, by SKAD network algorithm, because SKAD network works off a system of timers, right? Immediately after install, a timer starts, and after 24 hours, the timer resets. And then another resettable timer starts, and if no event has happened in that second timer, all of the events that have happened first get sent back to Apple. No other events get sent further. And I'm definitely grossly simplifying some of this.
Right.
And I have a YouTube video that goes into all of this into the weeds. If folks can check that out. But my point being, the fact that nearly all the trials happen within the first 24 hours make it relatively easier for subscription apps to have the signal be captured by SKAD network. That's another reason why subscription apps do quite well. And obviously, the more signal you give to the algorithm, the better the algorithm performs, right? In the pre-ATT world, if you give more purchases, the better the algorithm performs. Obviously, the algorithm would take purchases from you and everybody else in the world, and it would just do better. Now, obviously, it's just taking your trials and doing much, much better. And another trend we've seen is that web-based flows work a lot better for subscription apps than for games. Again, there are challenges in execution, but certainly one of the things we've seen that a lot of the relatively most successful apps are doing in the post-ATT world is adopt web-based flows, right? So I would say those are some of the factors that I think contribute to subscription apps being better off than games in the post-ATT world. Again, not to grandstand, not to declare this a victory yet, but I think that they're much, much better off.
Yeah, there's still also just the dynamic with consumable games. Like, I don't know what retention curves really look like and stuff like this, but with subscriptions, your acquisitions you're making today only affect, a chunk of your revenue in the very short term and you have this like recurring user base versus consumables. If your new users dry up really fast, like you've suddenly lost a lot of your business model doesn't work as well, right? So,
yeah.
But wow, that's incredible so on those CPIs for like social casinos or whatever, which I imagine is just a high spend category, highly competitive space. So if they don't have like value attribution, what's actually driving the CPI so high? Like, how do they know like what users to spend that much money on? Is it just, I guess, click based? Like, is it still like they can proxy and know like people that click on those are part of that high value group, or what keeps the targeting good enough so that, because you can imagine if everything was perfectly anonymous, all CPIs clicks would be the same, right, across all apps.
Yeah. At this point, I would not say we have a perfect answer for apps with high CPA. I think the best we have right now is treat Facebook reported metrics or platform reported metrics as directional, which means your CPA today would not be comparable to your pre-ATT CPA, but because it's going to be very, very high, just because of the privacy threshold that I just described, that if you're getting maybe $500 CPA on this and $700 on that, then you just infer campaign A is better than campaign B, but you're not inferring that is your actual cost of acquisition. So you're taking the CPA as a relative measure, and I think that's true for the casual game as it is for subscription apps. You're treating the CPA as a relative measure between campaign A and campaign B, and not so much as an absolute measure of unit economics.
I think that's a great point to transition into what's actually working right now. So we're talking about some of the impacts, but what you're kind of hinting at is something that you've mentioned before, is that the best source of truth now is not these highly specific return on ad spend calculation but actually using blended metrics. So tell me a little bit about how you approach thinking about blended metrics as a source of truth versus, the past, 5 or 6 years where it's way more focused on very detailed return on ad spend. And again, to our earlier point, even if that return on ad spend calculation wasn't actually as accurate as it seemed, you were at least able to calculate it more accurately. Now it's like kind of everything's out the window. So how are you approaching blended spend or blended metrics to measure these things?
I will add the caveat that the blended metrics isn't like modern or new, right? It's what old school offline advertising worked with, right? They were like, oh, this is how much I spent, this is how much I made. That's how they measured everything before the internet, right? And even with the internet, like a couple of companies we worked with, even pre-ATT, worked with blended metrics because they're like, look, we know that a portion of our paid installs drive organics. We have a very, very clear correlation between our paid and organic. So we would be leaving money on the table if all we took into account were paid users and not organics. So, people we work with have definitely done that. And there are companies that have done it just to pursue top line growth. They're like, look, we need to grow as aggressively as possible. And the way to do that is to take blended metrics to justify the growth rather than to shackle ourselves by taking just paid ROAS. But that's to your question. How practically, how do we sort of look at this? It just basically means we'll, instead of saying this campaign gave us a D7 return on ad spend of 20% or D7 cost per trial of $30, you're basically saying your overall marketing spend gave you a $20 cost per trial across paid and organic and social and everything that you're spending on, right? Obviously, that means a lot of people tend to be uncomfortable with that because they're like, oh, if I hadn't spent on marketing, I would have still gotten 200 trials a day. And I'm giving credit to marketing for that. And, I don't have a direct answer to that, but I think the answer really is, would you want a model that's helpful in helping you grow, or would you want a model that's accurate but isn't helping you grow? Right? And I'm not going to claim I have an answer to that one. Right? But so you're basically looking at your total number of trials and your total spend. And obviously, this calculation becomes hairier if you have multiple channels. If you're running Google, Facebook, Snap, and multiple ad networks, then you're like, oh, one of the ad networks probably performed badly, but my total blend is not changed all that much because my other channel was like 10% of the end stuff. So there are challenges, especially at large levels of spend, but it is a very solid source of truth, especially for smaller advertisers who may be on a handful of channels because it comes out of your iTunes. It's what you see in the bank.
And you also mentioned that sending people, you mentioned web flows are working really well. And I assume what you meant by that is sending people from an ad onto the web instead of onto the App Store, which is really fascinating to me on multiple levels because, the app stores have always been this black box where you put a certain number of clicks into it, and then you see the end result, but you don't see any of the steps in between. I mean, you have some basic metrics with App Store analytics and stuff. But with the web, I would imagine that gives you a more direct, trackable link from somebody who sees an ad to then actually kind of what they're doing on your website. So, but then ultimately, I've talked to a lot of developers who talk about how on the web, their conversions are actually quite a bit lower than in the app because Apple's made it so easy to use in-app purchase. So, but it seems like maybe there is somewhat of a balance there, is that maybe you lose fewer people from having to jump through those hoops of installing the app before they even get to the onboarding, before they can be shown the value proposition and then being, shown a subscription page or whatever it is. What have you seen working in regard to web flows and specifically for subscription apps?
Yeah. Like I said, I've certainly seen a lot of success for subscription apps that have adopted web flows. And a couple of apps I work with, they've seen month-on-month growth through ATT. Again, not saying that's typical result, but it definitely does happen. I think a couple of elements, I think what's most important is to make sure the flow is right. And there's a couple of possible flows. I think it's important to think through which one is right and really figure out what's right. Right. I think one flow could be show an ad, a user goes to a landing page, which is basically like a B2B or a B2C landing page on the web, what you would get for a web product. And you have a link that except the call to action on the landing page is go to the App Store. A lot of the experience, purchase and trial experience happens on the App Store. The web page actually does the job of selling the user on the product. And it's my hypothesis that this actually works well because the web page can do a much, much better job of selling than the App Store can, while still making it clear that this is an app, and while the actual conversion happens within the app itself. Right? Somewhat similar, a different flow that's very comparable would be take a user to an ad, take a user from an ad to a landing page where a user has to input their phone number, which again gets user to makes it clear to the user that this is an app, this is a mobile experience. The user gets a text message and user signs up for it. And when they click on the text message, they go to the App Store and download the app. Right. Again, another model could be a user clicks on an ad, goes to an article or a content page, which is more what you would see if you had a Taboola or an Outbrain ad. Again, the article or a content page leads to an App Store. And I think the last and I think the more complex flow is just to have onboard them on the web. Basically, take them to a web page and they onboard on the web, and they hopefully also actually make the purchase on the web, in which case you save the 30%. This is, to be honest, the hardest and the most resource intensive. And really, it's my recommendation that you pursue that path after you have pursued one of the other paths that I recommended, because you don't want to invest a ton of engineering and development time in building a web onboarding flow if you don't even know that the web flow is going to work for you. So I would recommend just testing the web landing pages first and then using the web onboarding flow. Right. I think those are some of the most important models that we see work. Something else I think that's also very, very critical is I think a lot of people, when they look at a lot of advertisers I know that started on the web for the first time, were like, oh, let's put together this nice landing page that looks like our home page on our website and just put it out there. And it doesn't work very well unless you're being very intentional about what value propositions to touch on, the actual layout of your landing page. And we have a structure that we use now, which is like your most important pain point and value proposition goes in the header. Then there's social proof, then your most important emotional benefits, then the features. I think the most successful advertisers we work with are very, very intentional about what that web page is looking like, and they also test rigorously. I think that all of those elements are very, very critical to making the web flow work.
Yeah, that's really smart. I hadn't thought of it quite that way about how, now so I was talking with the App Store being the black box, is you're just sending somebody hoping they look at the screenshots, hoping the icon resonates with them, hoping the title and subtitle are meaningful. But when you send them to the web, it's not just about pushing them right to subscribe on the web, but it's actually just having a better opportunity to communicate the value prop so that by the time they get to the App Store, they have a much higher incentive. They have a higher, they're just more likely to actually take action by the time they do get to the App Store. So that makes a lot of sense.
Tells you a lot about the quality of like the App Store as a sales pitch, right? I mean, but
Yeah,
I guess when you're like looking at you're trying to differentiate, right? And there's only so much you can communicate in a block of text and then a bunch of screenshots, right? You've seen so much data shoved into the screenshots on apps on App Store, right? They're not screenshots, right? They're like a slide deck.
Little billboards.
Yeah. I also think another reason why the App Store worked so well pre-ATT was Facebook would just show ads to users who installed other subscription apps. So if you send them directly to the App Store, they're almost pre-qualified, which is not the case anymore. So I think the Webflows level the field a lot.
Yeah, it's a tough skill set though for a lot of developers because like they don't often have web experience internally, and I think I hear so much like people get so obsessed about the 30%, and they want to jump straight to that last one you mentioned about building a whole online purchasing thing, which like Stripe's pretty easy to use. Like it's not that much more work than building a landing page, but you have to remember. Management. So now you got to have a link where somebody can go and cancel that thing. Now you also have to worry about taxes. Stripe doesn't like collect tax information for you already. You have to, then synchronize that with your backend. And, if you're using RevenueCat, you synchronize with us or whatever, but you got to manage all that too. It adds a lot of complexity for 30%, right? And when you're just trying to, all of these things can find incremental growth.
Yeah.
But like, as you're saying, it's important to put them in the right order or you can end up wasting a lot of energy and money.
Yeah.
Well, I did want to move on to the future. So we've kind of gotten through the first couple of months of this rough patch and are into this new era of mobile advertising. Are there any things that you're seeing that are especially promising that you think are the future? Like, is the future everything we've been discussing so far of just 50% of your advertising works and 50% doesn't, and you're never going to know which? Or are there some technologies coming online or some approaches that are just going to take time to kind of work out?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some changes. I don't know if these are going to be earth-shattering in terms of changing what's the new normal with ATT. I think the most promising, though, I would say, is iOS 15 custom product pages. Basically, it solves the problem that Jacob you were alluding to, which is you have one small slide deck and everybody sees the same thing, and the App Store does a terrible job of selling a user on what the product is. Basically, with the custom product pages, you can have up to 35 versions of your App Store, which means you're like, if you're a wellness app, if let's just say you're like a meditation app that has meditations for sleep or anxiety and how to meditate, you can have a separate landing page, so to speak, on the App Store for sleep, anxiety, meditation, right? And you get a unique URL for each of these. So presumably you can have an ad for sleep going to an App Store for sleep, ad for anxiety going to an App Store for anxiety. I think that can help. I just don't think it's going to help too much on the measurement front. Obviously, the actual execution is still unclear. The announcement's out. So I think definitely one of the bigger changes, I would say, that's coming with iOS 15. The other one would just be that advertisers are going to be receiving postbacks, which is huge, at least in ensuring accuracy of the advertising data so far. What's completely bonkers right now is networks like Facebook, Snap, everybody gets your post back from SCAD network, but you as an advertiser do not, which means you basically take the word for it. I do know for a fact that TikTok has actually changed values. I don't want to call it malicious because the conversion value was null and they changed it to 0. The problem is that null and 0 have very, very different meanings. 0 means install, and null means an install happened and there's just no value. So I know that they did that change. I don't know if they're continuing to do it. So But my point is, and Google explicitly says we are going to use modeled conversions, which basically means take our word for it. Facebook says campaign data is accurate, everything underneath is modeled, which means take our word for it. Which all of this is because the postback goes to the networks, but not the advertiser. With iOS 15, if the postback goes to the advertiser, you can at the very least verify that they're telling the truth, which bonkers considering, I think, David, you were mentioning, until all this time, you just had to take the platform's word for it, even pre-ATT, right? So I think that's going to be a big change, even though a lot of that's going to happen under the hood. And I say advertisers, for the vast majority of advertisers, the MMP is going to do the receiving of the postback, but I think that's going to be a big deal, right? I think those are some of the big changes, the custom product pages and the postback to advertisers. But really, in terms of the future, in many ways, I do think it's going to be back to 2013 or 2014. I think I talked about how we bought a number of installs, and we hoped that certain percentage, we knew that a certain percentage of them would convert to purchases. That was before subscription, so there weren't really trials. But I think it's going to be a very similar world. We're going to have to be more comfortable making decisions based off of incomplete data. But I do see that being the future.
One of the things I've been hearing a lot about since Apple announced ATT last year is incrementality testing. So systematically turning on and off, so if you're advertising, I mean, obviously this would be a tool for larger apps, but if you're advertising across Facebook, Google, Snap, TikTok, and, other mobile DSPs, systematically moving spend around and then measuring the difference, or even turning spend off in certain channels and increasing spend in other channels. Have you seen that work? And are you excited about the potential of having tools in this space? Or do you think incrementality testing is a bit overhyped?
So I think with any recommendation like incrementality, I think the one caveat that a lot of people miss is that it's useful for a very, very tiny fraction of advertisers. David, like you said, if you're on like all self-attributing networks, multiple DSPs, multiple ad networks, influencers, TV, yes, absolutely. You should use incrementality because there's just no way you're going to find out if this is going to work. And incrementality and media mix modeling, you want to use both of them hand in hand to make that work. But I would say the kinds of advertisers who need something like this are a very tiny fraction. So the vast majority of advertisers, even the advertisers who are on 4 to 5 channels, even advertisers who spend low six figures in monthly spend, I don't think incrementality testing is going to be very helpful or actionable, just because it's hard. It just becomes imprecise at small volumes of data. You need a critical mass of data for your analysis to be useful, right? And I think it's a very similar thing with media mix models, right? You need enormous budgets for those to be useful and helpful. So I do think these are great, but I think the fact that they're not an antidote to all of the havoc that ATT has brought about, they're applicable to a tiny sliver of the advertisers out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then if you're only advertising on Google or only advertising on Facebook or only advertising on the two of them, I mean, they're essentially doing some level of incrementality testing for you, right? They're measuring the performance of this campaign against that campaign, and they're ramping up depending on the results they seem to be seeing. So that some of that's kind of already covered if you're using those platforms as your primary sources. Another thing I wanted to get your thoughts on was experimentation with other forms of advertising. You're very focused, currently on paid user acquisition, and I don't think that's going away. And I think for a lot of apps, that is going to be the best, most reliable way to continue scaling, even without accurate measurement. But have you seen any other pushes with any of your customers to work on different styles of advertising, different approaches to marketing that are being successful? And do you see there kind of more incentive to try more things these days?
I spoke about web, and I think there's definitely much, much stronger interest in web campaigns than even 6 months ago. At larger budgets, there's definitely stronger interest in influencers. But I would, again, much like with the incrementality, I would say if you're on smaller budgets, I do not recommend experimenting. I do not recommend diversifying. Certainly at larger budgets, and I would also say folks that were spending in the tens of millions in budgets, folks like that have been, or even like millions a month. There's certainly some of the larger studios. They have already been on influencers. They've already been advertising on TV. So none of this would be new to them. Yeah, so I don't know if there's anything radically new that we see.
Yeah, and then that kind of gets back to the good old tried and true. Just got to build a good product and work on your monetization and kind of get back to the basics of product as well.
I think sometimes these overly complex, overly targeted systems, especially for people who make software, can tend to be busy boxes, right? They can tend to be things that like attract our attention and because they seem very like, we can get it right and really make it scale. And some people have, right? It's possible, but 80-20, I think for a lot of people out there, like just focus on the fundamentals and you can go pretty far. And then as time comes, you can layer in the more, complexity and precision.
Yeah. And like I said, at a certain level of scale, TV, influencers, all of this becomes much, much more meaningful. And like I said, web's certainly more meaningful already. But yeah, you don't need too much that's fancy.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. It was great chatting with you and a lot of insight there on what's working and how to think about things in this new world of mobile marketing. As we wrap up, is there any last thoughts? We're going to include links to where people can find you on the web and to RocketshipHQ and whatnot. Anything else you want to share?
No. Well, like I said, I think this was not as bad as we thought it would be. Certainly, there's ways to mitigate the worst case scenarios, some of which hopefully I've been able to share. So hopefully we'll come out on the other side of all of this without too much craziness.
I think people are going to keep using apps. That's my prediction.
And I think people are going to keep advertising apps.
Yeah. Certainly. It's the how that's going to have to change, and it has to change dramatically, and there's no getting around that.
Well, it was great chatting with you, and we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely, David. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.